My capstone analyzes the teaching practices of Audre Lorde, Toni Cade Bambara, June Jordan, and Adrienne Rich, who all taught literature and remedial writing in the SEEK program at the City University of New York. Their experiences teaching Black and Latinx students at this critical moment in university activism is important to understanding the contemporary relevance of their work. Each woman supported student efforts during the 2-week 1969 student strike and occupation of CCNY, teaching in reimagined classrooms, hosting panels, and encouraging student self-initiated learning. However, the role of Lorde, Bambara, Jordan, and Rich in the student movement began before the protest. In their classrooms, each woman emphasized deep consideration of community issues and critical assessment of the university. These 4 women believed in the radical potential of their remedial students and refused to participate in the elitist academicism that traditionally excluded them and others from university spaces. Just as protests called for universities to be more inclusive and socially accountable, Lorde, Bambara, Jordan, and Rich created classrooms that reflected those values. The learning environments that these CUNY professors created were both a catalyst for the student protests and a model for their vision. Highlighting these pedagogies now is important for a sustained critique of the way universities have ignored protest demands or superficially adopted them to avoid critique. Like the intentions of the 1969 student protests, the teaching work being done by Lorde, Bambara, Jordan, and Rich expanded the boundaries of what was accepted in academic spaces. They successfully changed the structure and content of their classes to promote accessibility in addition to student buy-in. Echoing the protest demand to create a school of Black and Puerto Rican studies, these SEEK professors used writing prompts that allowed their students to reflect on their own lives and communities. By accepting these assignments in many different media, Lorde, Bambara, Jordan, and Rich broke down rigid academic expectations in favor of promoting student learning in collaborative, flexible forms. Finally, echoing calls for increased student governance of universities, SEEK professors actively sought student input on the material and structure of their courses. Critical to understanding this educational project was the fact that these poor professors were teaching remedial writing. Traditionally a space of exclusion and regressive teaching, the pedagogical decisions of SEEK professors created remedial writing classes at a standard to which all courses can be held. 50 years later, universities can still learn from these democratizing teaching strategies in remedial and traditional classrooms across departments.
Hi, my name is Nadia Balderas, and the title of my Education Studies capstone is An Education of Our Own, Designing a Latinx School for San Antonio, Texas. It's clear that there are rather large achievement and opportunity gaps that exist between white students and Black and brown students in today's public schools, and this is a national education problem that most deeply affects the Latinx community. Latinx people in this country are actually the least likely to obtain a high school diploma or any sort of form of higher education. And this is something that I see reflected in my own community in San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio is the least educated big city in the entire state. Close to half of all residents don't ever go on to obtain any sort of degree from an institution of higher education. And this is something that drastically sets it apart from other cities like Austin or Dallas. And it's also something that's really interesting to think about when you consider the fact that Latinx people account for close to 70% of all of the city's residents. And even in a city where they constitute sort of the large and overwhelming majority, they still don't achieve at the same levels as students from other ethnic and racial backgrounds. And it was sort of the combination of all those factors that led me to explore the following research questions in my capstone. The first being, what are the current educational experiences, educational challenges, and educational outcomes for Latinx students in the United States, and in San Antonio in particular? And to what do we attribute the current educational disparities that Latinx students face? 2, what can be done and is being done to improve educational outcomes for San Antonio's Latinx students? Which reforms are likely to be unfeasible, which are likely to cause further harm, and which hold promise in terms of both feasibility and research-based evidence of success? And finally, what would a school in San Antonio, Texas that was designed specifically for its large and prominent Mexican and Mexican American communities look like? In order to carry out this project, I divided it into 3 parts. The first part being an introduction that identifies the problems with the ways in which Latinx students are currently being educated in the United States and in San Antonio specifically. Second was an exploration of what educational reforms are feasible or desirable but unfeasible, which are problematic or likely to worsen challenges, and which show promise for success. And lastly, a research and evidence-based proposal for a Latinx school in San Antonio, Texas. And all of these 3 parts were deeply engaged with the academic literature on Latinx education, but they were also in large part inspired by my personal experiences attending public schools in the city of San Antonio. This is a photo of my 5th grade class, my 5th grade dual language class, and I really took time in this project to critically analyze the educational experiences I had in my K through 12 education, and really felt that there were certain things that stood out to me as being really positive experiences that have stuck with me today. And it was sort of those experiences that I wanted to carry through to my own school, which I called the Emma Teniuka Community School, named for Emma Teniuka, who was a labor organizer in the city of San Antonio in the 1930s, a young woman who attended San Antonio public schools just like myself. And it was sort of for my own personal experiences, through research, and also for sort of the histories that have been forgotten and not taught in public schools, that I came up with these 5 guiding principles for what would be the Emma Teniuka Community School. The first being bilingual education. It would be a 2-way dual language immersion program in which students are encouraged to speak in English and in Spanish. All Latinx students, because the Latinx community has its own sort of cultural and linguistic diversity in and of itself. Second, race and ethnic studies, because there are histories that are not taught in public schools that should be taught to Latinx students. Second, community-based learning and schooling, because schools are so much more than just places where students learn. There's strong bonds between schools and sort of the communities that they exist in. They should be places where parents feel comfortable, where the community feels comfortable, and sort of points for community organizing and things like that. Racial and ethnic teacher representation, because it's important for students to be able to view their teachers as role models, to see themselves reflected in their teacher and school leadership body. And finally, culturally sustaining pedagogy, because there are specific ways to relate and not relate to Latinx students. And it was sort of the combination of all these things that sort of happened in isolated ways in my own education that I felt would make a school that brings the Latinx community closer to educational freedom and liberation, and sort of corrects for the ways in which they have been wronged by public education in history.
Hi, my name is Jack Lattimore, and today I will be talking about my capstone project on value-added modeling. So value-added modeling is a set of statistical models designed to assess teachers based upon how much they add to students' standardized test scores. And the use of this models for teacher assessment and evaluation is still fairly widespread within the US. So far, most of the research has either been quantitative, looking at the statistical foundations of BAM, or qualitative from educational, legal, policy angles, etc. So my project seeks to unite these two in order to perform a more comprehensive and holistic analysis. So I do this via 4 primary lenses. The first is political, in which I trace the roots of BAM back to the Cold War period, and then through the No Child Left Behind era of George Bush. And what I find is that BAM isn't so much geared towards benefiting students, but rather towards US global power and competitiveness, political maneuvering, and students assimilating and conforming. And as such, we should have real reasons to doubt whether BAM actually has students' best interests at heart. So next we can look at its quantitative foundation. So there have been many putative benefits of BAM, from high value added teachers leading to better college attendance rates, better salaries, etc. However, there are a few primary issues. The first is that teachers can influence a whole host of other skills. So, for instance, take student behavior. And when you look at those outcomes, you see that firstly, they are independent of the value added test scores. In other words, teachers that influence behavior don't necessarily influence test scores and vice versa. And secondly, they have just as much relation to these outcome measures as BAM, if not more. And secondly, there are other non-tangible skills, to take emotional intelligence as an example. And these skills have also been shown to have great importance to students' learning and their overall well-being, but aren't being captured at all by value-added scores. Next, there's some issues with value-added modeling's quantitative foundations, one of which is that it relies on random allocation of students to teachers, which clearly isn't true. Students might be assigned to a given teacher for a whole host of reasons, ranging from academic performance to their behavior to their compatibility with certain teachers. Marchetti and his colleagues found that not to be such a large problem, but Rothstein seriously questioned that evidence, and as such, there are serious doubts as to the extent to which value-added scores are actually statistically accurate or unbiased. So next we can look at high-stakes testing environments in real-world case studies through Washington, D.C. under Michelle Rhee and the impact system, and Atlanta under Beverly Hall. And in each of these cases, high-stakes testing, in which tests were responsible for teacher tenure, teacher salaries, teacher firings, etc., led to some really negative outcomes. It generated an overall culture of fear, and in DC led to significant pushback from teachers' unions, and in Atlanta led to a cheating scandal where student test scores were manipulated. And as such, high-stakes testing environments can have some incredibly damaging and repercussions. So finally, we can do a comparative analysis, so looking to places like Finland as well as education policy experts. They advise different teacher evaluation systems based on greater professional development, greater collaboration, greater mentoring, more metrics for assessing how students are doing than a single standardized test at the end of the year. So as such, from these recommendations and from the rest of our analysis, I argued that ultimately value-added modelling should not be such a large part of the education system as it is today. Rather, value-added scores, if they are used at all, should be used as one small piece of a teacher evaluation, and it should be made more comprehensive and holistic, which will ultimately generate greater teacher buy-in, lessen the culture of fear in schools, and also have a better impact for students. Thank you very much for listening.